Hello. This is the sixth podcast in this series of looking at basic ideas on paganism. And once again, I'm still in the kitchen doing my best Fanny Haddock impersonations. Today I am baking Lokshenkugel for the weekend for a gathering that's taking place, which appeals to my sweet tooth, if not to anybody else's. And the theme of today's podcast is looking at pagan notions around healing and healing techniques and so on. It was suggested by my adopted surrogate nephew, Tom, who is a medical student up north. So just to demonstrate that it's not only Jewish mothers who bake Lokshenkugel and go, "Oi, my son the doctor," it's also Druids who bake Lokshenkugel and go, "Oi, my nephew the doctor." So, there you go. Whilst I'm pottering around doing all of this, just that bit, there we go. It's worth starting off from the idea that medicine health generally is goal-oriented. In the study of ethics, which is something I teach at university, it's what's classed as teleological, from an old Greek word meaning goalpost, something that you head towards. A teleological ethic is where you've got an outcome, something you want to achieve, and you weigh up the morality or lack of it, the ethical value or lack of it, of an individual action as to whether it moves you towards where you want to go or it diverts you off into irrelevant directions. So in medicine, where you want to go, generally speaking, most doctors, nurses, psychiatrists, dentists, what have you, would say they've got an unwell patient and they want to move them towards a state of being well, of curing their illness, or if that's not actually possible, at least restoring them as close to good health as they can reasonably get them. And so if a particular medicine is being weighed up, or a surgical technique, whatever it may be, the question of is it ethical, is it not, is largely to do with does it work? Does it make this person better? Or does it make them worse? Or is it a quack medication that has no real impact whatsoever on the health of the patient? So there is a clear goal. Now within modern medicine, as within any kind of complementary alternative form of health and healing in the ancient world, much of what we now consider conventional modern medicine began in terms of things like herbal medicine. These days, obviously, we have pharmaceutical giants mass-producing pills and potions and lotions and various medications of one thing or another. Much of that began in the ancient world with the production of herbal medicine. And what large-scale pharmaceutical companies do is try to synthesize the active compounds found in various herbs and things. And obviously these days we also have loads of medications that were unknown in the ancient world. So things have moved forward on that sense, but they began in the ancient times. Surgery began in techniques in the ancient world. In India many thousands of years ago, they had developed techniques of rhinoplasty, let's say nose jobs. So even that kind of thing is in no sense new. These are techniques that have been knocking around for an awful long time and gradually developing and improving. The same kind of underlying ethos, we can say, is also gradually developing in the ancient world to get us to where we are now. So if we were to go back to, let's say, ancient Greece and go to one of the Asclepion, one of the temples of the god Asclepius, the great healer, these were staffed by priests who were also doctors, who were herbalists and surgeons and so forth, who would attempt to treat their various patients and restore them, and people would go to these places as pilgrimages to be restored to health. I suppose in much the same way as a lot of Catholics go to Lourdes and places like that, except whereas a Catholic going to Lourdes isn't expecting a priest to operate on them or prescribe the medication, they're just going to pray. In ancient Greece, they did both pray and undergo medical procedures and medical treatments. So it kind of combined the two. And certainly at that juncture in history, there was no great distinction made between what these days we might label as faith healing and more conventional medical techniques, herbal medications, surgery, changes in diet, I keep boiling over. All of those sorts of things were integrated together in ancient medicine. Whereas these days, obviously, medicine has gone secular and we no longer include a lot of what might be considered the more religious elements of healing in mainstream hospitals and places like, obviously you can still go and see your chaplain, but that's for solace rather than for medical technique. So you could say, if we're debating this idea of what is a pagan ethic of healing, then an integrated ethic is very much in keeping with the ancient practice. It was, well, these days we'd call it holistic. That wasn't a term that I was particularly bothered about in the ancient world. But the idea that you're treating mind and body and soul as an entirety. It's something that modern medicine is coming back round to, and a lot of doctors now factor in psychological health along with biological health, along with a sort of optimism and people engaging in life again, and the notion that those who are very engaged are more likely to recuperate quickly than those who are living in despair and unhappiness and so forth. So it's coming around again as a more widely accepted, more widely acknowledged ideal and concept. There we go. What I'd like to get us thinking about, and this is just sort of posing ideas rather than giving you answers, the typical philosophical approach, is to consider what is the pagan notion. And I don't think there is a pagan notion. I think there are a whole set of pagan notions that emerge from different cultures over different points of time as to the goal. So the goal is health in medicine. You've got an unwell person, you want to make them well. The two are flip sides of the coin. You can't really understand how to treat someone unless you've got an idea of what a well person looks like. At a very basic level, that's fairly obvious. We know what a fully functioning arm is like, therefore we can tell when it's broken. At that level, it's fairly straightforward. The arm either works or it doesn't work. The bones are intact or they're shattered, etc., etc. It gets much more obscure if we're thinking, for example, in terms of things like psychiatry. To have an understanding of what a dysfunctional, unwell mind is, you've got to have equally an idea of what a fully functioning, healthy, well-balanced, well-adjusted mind is. And that's really not a clear-cut notion, not in modern medicine, not in ancient medicine. There's all sorts of different concepts and ideas that float around as to how we define what is good health in the first place. And so from a pagan point of view, if we're thinking of an ethic, whether we're thinking the use of more mainstream conventional medicines, whether we're thinking meditation and chanting, whether we're thinking use of herbs, herbal medication, or pretty much anything else you want to chuck into that mix, before you can really begin effectively as a healer, you've got to have some notion as to what it is you want to restore your patient to. What constitutes good health for them? And that's pretty much the issue. It's a relatively individualistic concept, because what is good health for one person may be different for another. Someone born with twisted limbs, you may never be able to get them to the point where they can run a 4-minute mile, but you can perhaps make them more mobile through therapy and massage and medication and surgery and so forth. So for them, getting into a state of better health may be that they can walk a mile in an hour as opposed to walking it in 3 hours or not walking it at all. So different people have a different concept as to when their health is getting restored, when it's getting improved, and at what point they are happy to say, I've had as much treatment as I want to have, my body does the things I want it to do, not necessarily what anybody else wants it to do, but what I want it to do, and therefore I don't want any more surgery, I don't want any more interventions, I just want to get on with life, because some conditions you can have treatment after treatment after treatment. A lot of it quite intrusive, quite painful, quite disruptive of life. The person might need lots and lots of bed rest. It might be horrendously expensive. And it's not uncommon for people to reach the point where they just think, you know what, maybe another operation would improve me a little bit, but I really don't think it's worth the hassle. I'd much sooner just get on with my life from the point I'm at now. So there is a degree of self-determination in that. Two famous medical ethicists who wrote quite extensively, chaps called Beecham and Childress, certainly went into this idea of patient autonomy, that the patient has got to be part and parcel of the procedure. They're not just this lump of flesh that doctors come along and poke and prod and make better. And that's true whether we're talking about conventional Western doctors in the 21st century, or we're talking about Ayurvedic doctors in India, or we're talking about ancient Greek doctors of a couple of thousand years ago practicing herbal techniques or whatever. That patient is a human being. They've got to be consulted, they have to be informed of the procedures and consent to them, and they get to define, to an extent, the kind of health they want to move towards. And then the doctors tell them if they can get them to that point or not with the techniques available. And if they decide they've had enough, even if the doctors would like to do more, that patient has got to be left to their own choices. That's as true for pagan approaches to healing as it is for more secular approaches to healing. It's got to be an integrated process. What constitutes pagan notions of health is perhaps a more challenging concept, in that pagan notions of health, generally speaking, tend to include more ideas around the health of spirit, the health of mind, and not just focus on the health of body. So it's a more holistic, as I was saying a little earlier, holistic approach. And you can also factor in the idea that we work quite extensively with this notion of, I was going to say environmental health, but that conjures up images of councils laying in sewer pipes or something. The idea, shall we say ecological health might be a better way of putting it, that our relationship to the world around us shapes and informs our health. Now, this is not some radical hippy-dippy concept. Doctors have known for a fair stretch of time that if you live in squalid, filthy, unhealthy environment, you're desperately poor, you live in a very violent environment where you're always at risk and you're fearful and afraid. All of these factors come into play to make someone very, very unhealthy and unhappy. Unhealthy and unhappy very often go hand in glove, if we're being realistic. But within a pagan context, it goes beyond living in an environment with filthy water, or a very cold environment, a very damp environment that might lead to lung problems. There's more to it than the more, shall we say, straightforward or rational, whatever you want to phrase it, issues to take into account, because we have a lot of ideas in paganism around the spirit of place. The spirit of place, what the Romans called the Gaius Loci, is not just that sense of general atmosphere that some places are pretty and some places are ugly, but it's also the idea that there are actual entities, beings living in locations, beings in forests, in fields, in housing estates, and I don't just mean the humans or the rats and the sewage pipes, but that there are other entities around, entities that may long predate that housing estate, or that factory that somebody works in, or the home that they now live in, and that these entities can either be friendly or they can be unfriendly, and expose you to hostile forces can make you unwell. Try living with a really angry, vicious human being for a prolonged period of time, you find out how wearing and exhausting that is. It's no different than if you're living with a very hostile spirit of place that really hates the sight of you and doesn't want you there. It's tiring and exhausting and debilitating. And equally, if we're thinking in terms of treatment, then being in a place with a supportive, friendly, benevolent, helpful spirit of place can, from the pagan point of view at least, accelerate the healing process. So it's understanding the relationship between the human being and the environment that they're in. What am I not putting there? So I'm getting my ingredients all mixed up here. We could extend that to ideas that incorporate what is now called environmental psychology, which is much more. Environmental psychology includes things that are unrelated to this, I should say. But it's open to this idea that humans are improved in their state of health by exposure to natural environments. So if you live in a very built-up environment, an inner city, somewhere that's constantly full of loud noises and polluted air, polluted water, endless human beings in vast numbers here, there and everywhere, it's exhausting, it's debilitating, people get burnt out. So being able to go for a walk in the woods, hike up a mountain, sit on a beach, being able to go places where the air is clear and the water is pure, where you can go prolonged periods without having to see endless other humans. You can just go and watch the birds or see the deer run past or whatever it might be. That is restorative, it's healing. It's being immersed in place. And certainly if we're going back to Greece, to Rome, to the Celts, to all sorts of other earlier nations and peoples, many of them had the idea that sacred places frequently were not ones that massive great stone temples were plonked in. What made the place sacred as often as not was its natural beauty. So you would go to some spectacular waterfall or some serene forest glade, a magnificent mountaintop, and what made it holy was the place itself. You would just sit there and breathe it in and experience the spiritual uplift of the place, not because some ancient saint was buried there or because some massive great temple had been plonked there, but just the place in and of itself as it was sacred. And it's incorporating those sorts of ideas that we benefit from being open to restoring health by being in those sorts of places, by just spending time in wild, beautiful, gentle places, not cluttering them up with bringing our own chaos and mess, but just sitting still, having a minimal impact on those places, and allowing our souls, say that carefully, to interact with the resident spirits of those places. Allow healing to occur. We might add with spirits of place that there is always a degree of give and take. But perhaps part of what we give for a lot of these places is just our minimal presence, by agreeing not to do what humans so often do, which is leave mess behind and cause chaos in the process of getting there. Now, I do appreciate that having said all of that, it's much easier to say it than it is to do any of it. As we get more and more concreted over, as populations skyrocket to insane proportions, there are fewer and fewer places to go to that are peaceful and quiet and have minimal human presence. And a lot of these places are becoming prestige places. That is to say, they are expensive to get to because they're looked after by people who then, you've got to get airfares to get there, or you've got to be able to drive a 4x4 to get halfway up the mountain to see all this in the first place. So you've then got this notion that just as a lot of conventional medicine is very expensive and only accessible to the well-off and the terribly middle class who can afford it all, so increasingly what was once easily accessible to the common person with very little financial wherewithal the more we concrete it over, the further away it is, the harder it is to get to. You've got to be able to take time off work to get there, and if you've got one of those bosses that wants you chained to the factory floor or the shop or the office, wherever it is you work, then just being able to get to these places in the first place can be an uphill struggle. Those are all things we need to take into account if we're thinking of creating a healing ethic that responds to the way the world actually is these days, rather than this, shall we say, somewhat rosy glow of how the world used to be in millennia past. So that's something we need to take into account and think, how can we find healing and solace in places without ruining those places, without making them so inaccessible only the very fit, the very healthy, the very well off can actually get there in the first place. So if you are very unwell, getting halfway up a mountain can be, well, let's face it, nigh on impossible, let alone too expensive to do in the first place. So all of these factors come into play in thinking of not only how healing was understood 2,000, 3,000 years ago, but how practical circumstances tend to direct or limit people in the modern world. So that becomes another... They're just smashing the place. Another factor to take into account as well. It's probably worth mentioning that... God, I'm making a right mess of this. A lot of pagans, not every single pagan by any stretch of the imagination, but a lot of pagans believe in reincarnation. Unfortunately, as a result of various silly footballers in recent years making rather daft statements, some people have walked away with the notion that reincarnation, when it comes to things like health, can mean that someone is unwell or born with some sort of disability or whatever because of bad karma, man, and it's somehow connected to their past life. You'd have to be pretty dim, in all honesty, to go down that route and think that. But there are clearly quite a lot of pretty dim people in the world, not just dozy footballers, but others too, who struggle to separate these ideas in their mind, and so can heap burden upon burden, in that somebody might be struggling quite enough as it is to cope with their health issues without some sanctimonious pilchard telling them it's all down to what they did in some previous life when they were a bit naughty and this is their karma expiating itself now. And that's a very destructive, very caustic view and understanding of karma. It's also a really, frankly, rather informed one. If you factor in how karma obviously comes from Hinduism, how these ideas were understood, or still are understood, I should say, in countries where Hinduism is far more prevalent, we really do have the wrong end of the stick over here. We've inherited a very simplistic, very naive view of concepts like karma, and whether we want to blame a few hippies in the 60s and 70s coming back from stoned trips to India with rather garbled understandings, or we want to blame the authors of dodgy books, or indeed footballers, is somewhat of a moot point. But it's an idea that does the rounds, and I suspect it puts a lot of people who are disabled or living with some severe illness, it can put them rather off of paganism, which is a shame, because that's not how we should be understanding it. In the original sense, karma is more a sort of educational. You perform an action, there is a reaction. And if you are wise, you can learn from that reaction. The reaction per se is not there to teach you. It's a more of a automated process, if you like. but it's something that the wise can learn from. An illness isn't there to say, oh, you did a naughty thing, now you've got to learn, you've got to be made to suffer from it. Anything, health, illness, all sorts of states, can carry the notion that you can learn from them. So it might be the result of something you've done, if you're in an accident, or something that if the accident was caused by some other party, a drunk driver or whatever, that it's the consequence of their action, not of your action. Or it may be of completely unexpected and unintentional exposure to environmental factors that have caused damage to health that the person was unaware of. Sometimes, obviously, people can develop liver cirrhosis as a result of drinking far too much, things like that. So there is sometimes an element in which a person has contributed towards their own ill health. But getting sanctimonious and judgmental about it really doesn't do anybody any favours anywhere. It's something that needs a compassionate response rather than a judgmental response. And we could say that if we're thinking of a pagan ethic towards health, then one that is very compassion-centred is the key. That understanding that health or illness, physical, mental or anything else, is a struggle for many, many people, and that what they need is support, friendship, sometimes aid, sometimes just to be left in peace. That these are conditions that any single one of us could potentially suffer from in the future, so making life awkward for someone because you think, oh, well, if they hadn't done this, they haven't done that, they wouldn't have had these problems. Even if you happen to be right, well, which often people aren't, but even if they are, there's nothing to say that we may not be doing things that one day may lead us to a state of great ill health, where what we will need is not some sour-faced person being sanctimonious towards us, but kindness, compassion, if necessary, help. Without getting too political, we could translate that into an understanding of how health services should be offered and operated. If we look to early medieval Ireland with the Brehon laws, a law code which many people have argued stems from Druidic times, even though it was continued to be practiced in Christian times. It was the duty of each chieftain to gather in tax money and spend some of this tax money on the running of a hospital. So a building, and the Brehon laws go into a fair amount of description as to what that building should be like. They talk about having opened 4 doors to allow breeze, clean air to go through, that it's got to be constructed near running water, it's got to be kept clean, the nursing staff who work there must all be sober and responsible, there should be no noisy people around, no yapping dogs, the place should be calm, it should be cared for, and it recommends various guidelines on how experienced the doctors running these places should be. Once somebody falls ill, or they have an injury, an accident or whatever, and they go to one of these, or went historically to one of these places, everyone within the tribe was allowed a certain level of free healthcare. So they didn't have to pay for the treatments. If the healthcare was very, very extensive, then the evidence suggests that they were asked to kind of top it up, or at least their family were asked to chip in towards it, but to a basic standard level. For standard healthcare, it was free for everyone in the tribe because it was paid for out of taxation. Fundamentally, that's a very early form of the NHS, basically. There are other cultures in which healthcare was very much a private thing. So if you could afford it, you had it, and if you couldn't afford it, you died in the gutter. I know which of those options I would prefer society to run by. I'm very much a supporter of the NHS and the idea of healthcare that's free at the point of service and free to the level of need. That we do put our tax money and if necessary pay a little bit more tax money towards ensuring that any of us who might, and any one of us might fall ill, might have accidents, have free healthcare available, rather than it being a restricted privilege
of those with enough cash to splash out for it. A little bit of politics there, as Ben Elton would drearily say. Those ideas, garbled and incoherent though they are, deal with both notions of what is health in the first place. And you do get variable notions on that, particularly when it comes to ideas of mental health. That's perhaps something for a separate recording or for other people to do their research on, because in a lot of pagan cultures, being able to see spirits and entities and interact with the invisible world is considered perfectly normal, even desirable. Behaviours that might, to a lot of other cultures, seem delusional, seem to be signs of mental disturbance. So there is a notion that what is normal in one culture can seem very peculiar in another. And how do you define good mental health? I'm inclined to go down the line that the German psychologist Alfred Adler suggested of Gesellschaftsgefühle, which is the idea that a truly healthy, well-adjusted person is one who loves life, who embraces their neighbours, even when those neighbours can be trying and annoying, still wants the best for them, who embraces the beauties of nature, who embraces the joy of being around other living creatures, and wants the best for others. So someone who is philanthropic, who, even if they're having bad days and points of time when they struggle, nonetheless overall aspires to the good of living beings themselves, other humans, other creatures, plants and so forth, and wants to actively participate in life. For Adler, people who withdraw, shut themselves off, become cranky, resentful, misanthropic, are suffering problems. And I know that's remarkably hypocritical of me, because I am a deeply misanthropic person in many, many ways. But I do recognise Adler's point that that's not a healthy thing. It's probably doesn't say an awful lot about my mental health. But to embrace life rather than resent it, fear it, back off from it, avoid it, is a sign of good health. Not all pagan cultures would necessarily go along quite such a skipping in the woods definition of mental health, but I think it's a good working definition, and it embraces the pagan ethos of being in harmony with nature and seeking balance with the land, the world around you, as much as one can do. And obviously that's if you live in an earthquake zone or somewhere like that, that can be really, really challenging. But a sign of good mental health, to want the good of your fellow humans, those who are in your tribe, to want, in very generalised terms, because when we're thinking of the whole human race, it all does get a little bit abstract, but to want the good of the human race, to want the good of other beings, cats, dogs, horses, what have you, around you, and to be out there engaging. That to me is a sign of good mental health. And we can well make the argument, as many pagan cultures have, that what is good at one level filters out to the good of other levels. So if you've got that good inner core of spiritual balance, it filters out to a more psychological level of good health, and filters down to fair bodily health, allowing for injuries, allowing for genetic conditions, that whatever the limitations of your body, you seek to enjoy it as much as you can do within practical considerations. Let's put it like that. That's perhaps the nicer way of putting it. That it's not all about the pursuit of perfection and obsessive ideals that everyone's got to have a six-pack to prove how super-duper fit they are or anything like that. You can have a perfectly average-shaped body and be healthy, be well-adjusted, be well-balanced. To finish on, I'm sure you've been screaming for the last half hour for me to finish. I think it's worth noting the recommendation that was carved into one of the remaining walls of the temple at Delphi in Greece, which said all things in moderation. Let's apply that in a modern health context, you want to drink alcohol? Drink alcohol. You want to eat cream cakes? Eat cream cakes. You want to have a fag? Have a fag. We'll draw it there before we go into anything illegal. But whatever you want to do it in moderation. Don't smoke to the point where you've got lungs like old leather. Don't drink until your liver is pickled. Don't eat cream cakes until your legs collapse under you because you've become so heavy. All things can be enjoyed in moderation. It's not an advocacy for some puritanical regime of health obsessiveness. It's saying enjoy life, have fun, go to parties, do nice things, stuff your face on cream cakes, do whatever you want to do, but don't take it to ridiculous excess. Don't make yourself ill doing it, and if we're thinking of stuff like drunk driving, don't make other people ill as a result of your excess. That would have to include things like production of substances. So if the pleasure you take from something can only be achieved by some really dodgy exploitative production methods, then don't do it. But enjoy life. Life is there to be relished as much as you can, but just don't abuse it. Don't destroy your body, don't destroy anybody else's body. That's probably more than enough waffle on that subject. I'm sure Tom will now tell me that I've forgotten a dozen and one different things and I should have said this, that and the other, but hopefully it will do for now, and I've got to get this kugel in the oven, so I'll leave it there.